it's great to be creative. So it's either like
There's a lot of things like
So the first thing you have to lawyer
yeah, I mean, he actually, that's how he started.
Yes.
So I'm
But that's so
very few coaches come in and be these guys
You can choose.
she had to do that.
Welcome, people. Thank you for coming to PANMA's first 2015 event. And I wanted to ask, first of all, is there anybody who's come in that we didn't check in?
Anybody who did register, who did not check in?
Who registered isn't checked in?
Yeah, I'll swing by.
All right, we'll get it. Okay. My name is Reed Gusto. I'm on the board of the Philadelphia Area New Media Association, or PANMA. And the first thing I always like to ask is, for how many people here is this your first PANMA event? Ooh, fantastic. Welcome. Glad to see you here. We hope you come back for more. Philadelphia Area New Media Association has been around since 1996. And what we do is in our tagline, connecting the digital development community since 1996. And we're a big tent organization. We don't follow any one programming language or platform, or our topics are very wide. Anything having to do with digital development, graphic design, content, database programming, WordPress, Drupal, PHP, ASP, all kinds of things involved with the internet, which is pretty much everything these days. Tonight's event is How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Never Be Done. I know that never be done is not what you want from an introductory speaker. So I'm just going to give you some housekeeping and then we'll turn it over to Dave. We have some events coming up. We're heading out till June. In February, we will have a project management panel. And in March, we'll have Brian Crumley speaking. He's from O3 World. This is a major agency. In May, we're going to have our show and tell, where we will have these quick presentations that we will ask for the community to present. That call will be going out a little later on in the spring. And in June, we're going to try an all-day workshop. We haven't figured out the topic, but we've never done this before, something new. And it's been something people have asked for, so we're going to give it a shot. I want to tell you a little bit about tonight's speaker. And I wrote down some notes because he's very accomplished, and to list them all would take quite a while. So I just wrote down a few of them. Dave Dylan Thomas is a content strategist for EPAM, and he's one of the major organizers of Barcamp Content. He's the founder of Content Camp. He's the head of Content Strategy Philadelphia, and the creator, director, and co-producer of Developing Philly, which is a web series about the rise of the Philadelphia tech community. And I could go on, but he'll tell you a little bit more about himself. He's a very accomplished guy, and he's a very decent human being on top of everything else. So let me give you David Dylan Thomas.
First off, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Second off, I just learned apparently Brian Crumley's giving a talk soon. Check him out. That guy is amazing. So we're here at Agile Living, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Never Be Done. As said before, my name is David Dylan Thomas. I'm a content strategist at EPAM. We're that way about 10 miles. And the hashtag for tonight's talk, if you are prone to tweeting during a talk, is Agile Living. You may also use Panma. My Twitter handle is movie_pundit, because for some reason I decided an underscore would be a good thing to have in a Twitter handle. So I'd like to begin tonight by telling you a story about a true event that happened to me once upon a time when I went up for a job interview. And one thing I really like about this particular piece of stock photography is these two seem really into the guy. They're like, yeah. But this guy's like, yeah, there's no way you're getting this job. They're just totally not into it. So my particular job interview went really well. It was a job that I really wanted. It was at a company that I respected, and I thought I could do great things. And the interview itself, the term rock star was thrown around a lot, not by me. It was great. And I remember walking out of that interview, getting on the street, walking away from the building, and the first thought that hit me was, if I get this job, I'm done. That's it. I'm there. I've made it. The very next thought that hit me was, that's ridiculous. Of course I'm not done. I'm still going to have to take out the trash. I'm still going to have to change my son's diaper. I still have 40 movies I want to make that aren't going to get made just because I got this job. I won't be done. Things might be better than they were before, because the job I had at the time I hated. But I wasn't going to be done. So I needed maybe a new way to think about my feelings about that job. And here's where I'm going to kind of back up and talk about Agile for a bit. So how many people here are familiar with the term Agile, Agile processes, Agile workflows? How many people have actually been on a project that uses an Agile? Okay. So let me start off by saying I'm going to make some of you very mad. Because what I'm going to be talking about is almost an abstraction of Agile workflows. So you're not going to walk out of here a certified Scrum Master. But I am going to talk about what I believe are some of the principles that support Agile and that result in some of the ways that Agile works. So for those of you who don't know, Agile is one of two kind of predominant ways of getting things done right now. One of these is Waterfall. We'll talk a bit about how that works. And then the other contrasting paradigm, way of doing stuff, is called Agile. Now, Waterfall makes a few basic assumptions about the best way to get something done. The first thing it kind of assumes is the outcome. If you're building a house, Waterfall basically says, look, we're going to build a house. Here's the blueprint. Bathroom's going to go there. Bedroom's going to go here. Plumbing's going to work like this. Electricity's going to work like this. We wrote it all down so we know what's going to happen. We know what we're going to get. Let's all agree that this is what it's going to look like. Go off and build it. Tell me when you're done. As a result of that assumption, there's not a lot of check-in in between. I mean, sure, you'll sort of check in from time to time, make sure the bathroom's actually there, but Generally speaking, the idea is we can all agree on the outcome, so we don't need to communicate all that much while we're actually doing the work. And as I kind of implied before, the final delivery, when we actually show you the house, that's pretty much it. We're not going to show you, here's the finished bathroom, what do you think, before we move on. We're just going to finish the project. Agile makes some different assumptions about the best way to approach a project. It doesn't assume the outcome so much as it assumes the goal, right? It doesn't say, we are going to build this exact house. It says, okay, it seems to me that you want a place to live, and that place should have certain features, like it should keep you warm, and you should be able to keep your stuff safe in it, and it should have water easily accessible. We're going to agree that that's the goal. And we may even draw up some basic ideas, maybe even some blueprints saying, okay, we think this might be the best way to get that done. But we're not going to simply assume that that is in fact what we're going to get. We're just going to agree on what the goal is. As a result, we're going to have frequent check-ins, every single day, in fact. Now, these aren't going to be hour-long meetings, and we'll talk for a bit about what that looks like. But we're going to check in frequently because we're learning as we go, and we want to share some of that learning. Because it may turn out that the bathroom is going to work out a lot better over here than it's going to be over there. And if we make that learning, Agile assumes it's okay to change that plan. As a result of that assumption, you're going to have multiple deliveries instead of one delivery. Every 2 weeks, in fact, if this is a typical Agile project, right? First couple of weeks we'll work on the electricity in the bathroom and we'll see how it went and we'll say, okay, that part was good, that part was not good, and we need to change that. Now we're going to just iterate on it and we'll show you the next version of that the next week. You release different features as you go along and you look at them and you examine them and you learn from them and you keep building. So by the time you get to the finished house, you've actually seen the whole thing already and iterated on the whole thing already. But delivery happens quickly. There's a phrase, release early, release often. So these are two different approaches to solving the same problem. And I should stress, I'm giving you the extreme versions, right? Of course you're going to talk to people during a waterfall project. Of course there's going to be some sense of outcome during an Agile project. What we're talking about is a spectrum, but the fundamental assumptions are different. So what difference does it make? House is going to get built anyway, right? Why should it matter at all whether I choose to use Waterfall versus Agile when I'm trying to do something? The answer is this. How many of you remember the first time healthcare.gov came out? Awesome, right? So I highly recommend, I'm going to give you some homework, I highly recommend you check out Clay Shirky's article about the creation of this website. Because he uses it as a way to talk about Agile. And he basically says, look, when you approach a project like this, you're almost forced to approach it waterfall. Why? Because it was the result of policy, right? The lowest bidder, right? You need to be able to present someone with a finalized plan before they will give you taxpayer money to do something. It's very difficult to be Agile in that kind of environment. The problem is, once the thing finally gets finished and you release it, no matter what, when you're doing software design, you are going to have a testing phase. You are going to have a phase where you show it to people and they try it and they find bugs. It's called QA, quality assurance, comes by many different names, but at the end of the day, it involves people using your stuff and seeing if it works. And where it doesn't work, someone writes it down and says, okay, you need to fix that. It happens no matter what. In this case, it happened after it was launched. That's where Waterfall brought them. In an Agile workflow, all of that, remember that frequent delivery, frequent check-in, all of that would have happened beforehand. And one of the other interesting aspects of this is there is a failure is not an option kind of mantra that can bleed into a project like this. Again, especially when it's for the president, who, by the way, is speaking like over in Society Hill right now. I don't know if you know that. Give a chance to run. When the president is your boss, right, and failure is not an option is the mantra, how likely are you to tell anybody up the chain something's going wrong? So when all the news came out and they were saying, Obama was saying, oh, I didn't know, and it sounded like a big excuse, frankly, if this was the way they were doing it, I am not surprised at all that he didn't know. Because who wants to be the person to tell him, oh yeah, it's not working at all? Whereas in an Agile workflow, the point is to make sure you find out as early as possible if something is going wrong, because then you can adjust. But there's something he says in that article that I feel is the perfect summation of the difference between an agile mindset and a waterfall mindset. By putting the most serious planning at the beginning, remember that blueprint, with subsequent work derived from the plan, the waterfall method amounts to a pledge by all parties not to learn anything while doing the actual work, right? Because you're basically saying, this is the blueprint. We all agree this is the blueprint, this is exactly how it's going to turn out. Why would we need to learn anything while we build it? It assumes that it's like building an IKEA cabinet, right? Here's the plans. Just follow the instructions. The outcome is predictable. You don't learn anything building an IKEA cabinet except for how shitty some IKEA instructions are. But you don't learn anything. The outcome's already been decided. But in real life, in 99% of projects, you don't really know what's going to happen. You are definitely going to learn something. The only question is the way you're doing it allowing you to make any benefit from that learning? And Agile is designed to actually harness that learning. So this is something you'll see a lot of when you're talking about Agile. It's this notion of build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn. This has actually been adopted into a business workflow called lean startup methodology. Agile, you'll find, has sort of found its way into lots of different disciplines now. It started out more as a software engineering kind of discipline, but now it's found its way into lots of different disciplines because it's pretty sticky. And this basic mantra is at the heart of it, right? You're going to build something, you're going to measure it, find out how it did, and then you're going to learn from that. And what you learned, you will then factor into your next build. So this is an extremely powerful way of thinking about the world. And we're going to back up for a sec, and I'm going to tell you why I think Agile is kind of having a moment right now. And it has a lot to do with a certain point we've reached in technology. First piece of that is what I call the age of experiential tech. So for a long time, when we built products, they were finished, and they were easy to understand. They were functional in a very obvious way. This is a washing machine. Take a wild guess what it does, right? If I were to walk up to you, and you've never heard of a dishwashing machine before, I said, hey, there's this thing called a dishwashing machine. Before I've said another word, you probably know what it does, and you probably know whether or not you want one, right? Pretty straightforward. Now I walk up to you and say, hey, there's this new thing called Twitter. Gonna need a little more. And even if I give you a little more, right, I say, okay, well, see, it's this thing, and you type out some words, but only 140 characters, and then other people can see it, and you can follow people. I mean, not literally follow people, right, but you can kind of see what they're, and then you can see what they, you're not going to get it. You have to actually use it before you can even have an inkling, A, what it does, and B, whether or not you even want to use it, right? Not like the washing machine, right? So that's why I call it the age of experiential tech, because you kind of have to experience it before you even know what it does. And we make a lot more of this now than we do of the washing machine. And even the washing machine now is a little more like this. And what I mean by that is the tech that we build today is generally unfinished, right? Twitter isn't really so much a product as it is a set of rules that we released into the wild and saw what happened. It's almost more like emergent tech, right? Rule number one, you can type 140 characters, right? That's your limit. Rule number two, you can decide who sees that message and who doesn't, and which messages you see. Rule number three, open API. And that's the very, very important rule, right? Because now people can write different programs for it. So we just release that into the wild and see how people use it. Rather than, here's a washing machine, here are the instructions on how to use it, that's it. It's a closed system, right? And what we find out is the product gets finished by the users. That's a very new way of doing things. I'll give you an example, the hashtag. Twitter did not come up with the hashtag. That was not a bunch of people sitting in a room saying, what new features can we add to this release of Twitter? No, it was a user who said, if I do this, it'll make it easier to track different memes and ideas through the web. Now, eventually someone at Twitter blessed it and said, okay, we'll make it blue. But the actual feature of the hashtag was created by the user. That is now becoming more of the norm than here's a washing machine with all the instructions. All the features are written down here. There will be no more. What's interesting about this is that this model maps very nicely onto the natural world. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the first piece of that is that people who work on what they call mind-brain interfaces, right? So this is, you've lost your arm, we're adding a mechanical prosthetic limb to you, and your brain is going to have to talk to that mechanical limb to move it, right? It's actually an electrical interface. The way they build these things, they've discovered, isn't, okay, we are going to map this neuron to this wire and this neuron to that wire. The way that actually works is to build half of it, and then the brain kind of fills in the blanks. There was a guy who was talking about this, and he said the analogy would be if I were trying to build a bridge across the Schuylkill, the way to build it would be actually only to build half the bridge and then let the rest of the bridge construct itself. That's how those interfaces actually work best. And a lot of the products we create today are very much like that. We kind of just built half the bridge. Once it's good enough, we release it into the wild, and the world creates the rest. So this is being in a state of perpetual beta, is one of the ways people put this. And the weird thing about it is, this is very common right now, and none of us really have that much of a problem with it, and there's a reason. So remember I was talking before about math, and how there's this big tech leap forward that's happening that's making all of this actual agile moment make sense. So this is an image produced by Fractals. And fractals are very important to this conversation. Are people familiar with the term fractals? Okay, so at a very high level, you're not going to walk out of here with a math degree here, but at a very high level, a fractal is basically an equation that produces a number, then you take that number, you put it back into the equation, produce it again, produce it again, produce it again, and eventually it draws something like this. Now, the math for a fractal, like what that equation is, we've known for a very long time, almost 100 years by now. But the ability to actually calculate it didn't come until computers got computing power, right? To actually sit down and whatever equation produced this, run that about 1,000 times, 10,000 times, would pretty much take you your whole life. A computer can do it like that. There's a pretty picture. The fact that we can do that now has changed everything. Here's an example. Does anybody know what this is? This is why we have this. It's the antenna that goes inside of a cell phone. The only way to make that antenna is to create a shape that can fold in on itself. That's one of the nice things about fractals. They have this thing called self-similarity, and they can kind of fold in on themselves over and over and over again. You could not make a cell phone work. The antenna that would make it work would be too big unless you know how to make the equation that makes the shape that lets it fit inside there. That's one of the big leaps forward that fractals gave us. Now, the interesting thing about fractals, it's not just that now we can put them in our phones, it's that nature has been putting them in everything this whole time, right? That lightning strike, if you were to zoom in on it, you would see something that looks almost exactly like the big version of it. Same with the shell, same with the snowflake. The most mind-blowing example for me is leaves. So if you go to the rainforest and you look at one tree, right? Some of the leaves on that tree are going to have thick branches, and some of those branches are going to be thin, right? Then if you kind of back up and you look at the whole forest, some of the trunks are going to be really thick, some of the trunks are going to be kind of thin. The ratio of thick to thin for the branches and for the trunks is exactly the same. That shouldn't be, but it is, because that's just how nature rolls, right? So fractals produce that kind of thing, which means that we now have the ability, right, to create tech that behaves like the natural world. We really weren't able to do it this way before. And not coincidentally, we're creating things that are kind of unfinished, just like the natural world. Because that tree's never really finished, right? It's constantly growing, it's constantly evolving. Nature's never really finished. And by some odd coincidence now, neither is Twitter. Neither is Wikipedia. Who wakes up one morning and says, okay, we're done. Good job, everybody. Wikipedia's finished. Y'all go to bed now. Thanks. And neither are you, right? You are, whether you like it or not, whether you do anything with it or not, constantly evolving, constantly changing. So this really smart guy, David Weinberger, who wrote a book called Everything is Miscellaneous, that I highly, highly, highly recommend you read. I consider it part of the digital canon, was at a graduation ceremony once. And he gave a speech where he was talking about the problem of mastery, right? How can we really say that anyone is a master of anything anymore? Because that notion used to mean, okay, there are this many books about Shakespeare. You read them all, you got it, you're a master. right? You read them and understand them, you got it, you're done, right? What he's saying is that the nature of knowledge isn't really like that. He's comparing it to Webby. He says that the Webby structure is a more accurate reflection of the shape of knowledge, right? Endless series of connected ideas and facts, limited by interest, but not an article that starts here and begins there, right? Not something that is a beginning and an end. In fact, I'd say Shakespeare himself was a web, and so am I, and so are you. We are not this fixed thing. We're actually interconnected. We're actually constantly evolving. This is why perpetual debate doesn't really bother us, because we've lived with it our whole lives. We've watched nature shape and grow and change our whole lives. We watch ourselves shape and grow and change our whole lives. It's actually more normal for us to see a product that is constantly evolving than to see just, okay, here's the coffee cup, it's done. Nothing more to say. Nature releases early and often, right? This is essentially what evolution is. It's sort of a long game, agile process. So your life is not a to-do list that you're going to be check off and then one day be done. There is no point at which you actually will be done. I mean, technically it is, but it's a grim thing to think about. Your life is not Waterfall. Your life is Agile. You live in this build, measure, learn kind of atmosphere. That's a more accurate reflection of the true nature of life and the true nature of the problems that you're most likely to encounter. And this is why it began to occur to me that the way to think about that job interview was much more like this. So here's a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson, which I thought was very smart. Whether or not you can ever become great at something, you can always become better at it. This ends up being a healthier attitude, and it's one that you'll notice most of the people who are considered masters still kind of hold. You look at anyone who's really, really, really good at something, 9 times out of 10, they will tell you, I am still learning. I am still getting better. So I'll give you an example. This is Sam Raimi, and you may know from such films as Evil Dead, Spider-Man, pick your pick. And when he first started out, he would make these little horror films, and he would show them at the student center, and the students would hate them. And he'd be there in the booth listening to the hate. And what he would do is he would listen for when the hate was the highest, right? Then he'd go back and cut out those parts, put the movie back together again, show it again. Different crowd, see when they start to yell how much it sucked, say, okay, move those around, show it again, show it again. He was basically using an iterative process to improve his film before he even became somebody. And even to this day, he'll tell you, yeah, Spider-Man 3 sucked. I don't know what I did wrong there. I got to learn from that. Wasn't really crazy about that Oz movie. I got to work on that, right? He's still learning. He's still iterating. So what I want to get away from, and what I saw myself slipping into after I walked out of that job interview, is this notion of, if only I can get the perfect job, if only I could find the perfect mate, if only I could reach this ideal weight, everything is going to be okay. That is a great idea if you're writing a story, if you're making a movie. I'm a filmmaker, I'm a storyteller. I know, you gotta have rising action, you gotta have a goal for your hero. It's fantastic for narratives, essential even, but it's terrible for life. It doesn't map to actual reality in any way, shape, or form. So anytime you hear yourself or someone else saying, everything will be all right if, your bullshit detector should start to go off. Part of the reason is science, right? They've done a lot of studies around this, and there's this thing called hedonic adaptation. What it basically means is no matter how good a thing happens to you or how bad a thing that happens to you, eventually you'll pretty much go back to where you are, right? So if you're a miserable bastard and you win the lottery, after about 3 months, you'll go back to being a miserable bastard. If you are happy-go-lucky and you lose a leg, after about 3 months, you'll go back to being happy-go-lucky.
That's true.
They actually literally tracked people who won the lottery and who became paraplegics. And within a year, they were both back to their baseline happiness. Our bodies, our minds just get back to a baseline. One of the other things they've noticed studying this, however, is that lots of small wins actually impact your happiness more than one big win, right? So you have the perfect wedding day. I had a great wedding day. Amazing, one of the best days of my life. After about 2-3 weeks, I was back to complaining about my job, right? My shitty commute, all of that. However, lots of little wins, those can actually perk you up, but the trick is you have to be on the lookout for them. Nice thing about Agile is, and we'll see when I show you actually how to build the tasks that go into Agile, gives you lots of small wins. And in fact, it pulls a little trick where even when you lose, you still win. So one of the things, if you think about that build, measure, learn paradigm, is that failure suddenly takes on a different scope, right? Failure is no longer humiliation. Failure becomes information, right? It's actually kind of essential. If I don't fail, I don't learn. If I don't learn, I have nothing to put into the next build to make it better. So if failure is knowledge, and knowledge is power, all of a sudden failure becomes power. Think about that paradigm in your workplace. It's why we see things like this. Now, I tried to source this quote, and if any of you actually knows who really said it, please let me know. But everybody from Reed Hastings to Dr. Sharon Fleming is the person who said this, right? But this has started to become more of a mantra at kind of really forward-thinking companies like Netflix. So reward success, celebrate failure, punish inaction. Why? Well, if we actually believe that failure is learning and failure is power, then you actually do kind of want to celebrate it, because what you're actually celebrating is, hey, we learned something. That's great. Let's go learn more. The other reason you want to celebrate failure is because if you punish it, you will, I guarantee you, and I've seen it happen time and time again, you will create a bureaucracy, right? Because what is the true purpose of a bureaucracy? It's to make sure nobody messes up, right? It's to make sure that nobody can fail. We'll make a rule against that. That thing went wrong, okay, let's make a rule. Okay, it won't go wrong anymore. And if it does, that person will be punished or kicked out, right? So now, all of a sudden, what we're agreeing on, instead of the goal, what we want to accomplish, we're all agreeing on how not to get caught, how not to mess up. We're all now motivated, incentivized to play it safe. We're incentivized to not fail, right? But intuitively it makes sense, right? I wouldn't want to fail. But if you're going to do that, you're never going to innovate. Because what does all innovation require? Risk. Lest it wouldn't be innovation. It would just be what you did before that you know is safe. Now, I've talked about Agile for a while. Rah, Agile. Let's go out there and fail. Let's learn from that failure. It is not meant to be applied over everything. Whenever you have a situation that involves a high degree of risk, Agile might not be the best fit for you, right? I don't want Agile surgery. I want you to get it right the first time. Really, failure is not an option. This is a case where that's true, right? And you can even see in the same company, right, situations where innovation, Agile, failure is rewarded versus not. So take Netflix, for example, and there's a slideshow. I'm actually going to recommend a slide deck to you, believe it or not. Reed Hastings did called Freedom and Responsibility. You can look it up on SlideShare. It's amazing. But one of the things you sort of learn from it is that in certain areas, they encourage risk. They have that celebrate failure mantra, right? In other areas, like, say, credit card information, there's no tolerance for risk. That's extremely rigid. You want Waterfall there, right? You want to know the outcome when you're talking about whether or not someone has access to my credit card information. So even in the same company, the same business plan, you can have room for both. But I will argue that 90% of the time, and 90% of the problems you're going to encounter in your life, build, measure, learns, end up being a more accurate map of what the world is really like. So that's all theory, but how do you actually do it, right? How do you take these agile workflows or whatever and say, okay, I'm actually going to try this out in my real life? So for me, that moment started to come when I was working on a series Reed was talking about before called Developing Philly. It's a web series about the rise of the Philly tech community. And somewhere toward the end of production and the beginning of post-production, my co-producer and I made a decision. My co-producer is Maurice Gaston, and he is a certified Scrum Master. And he thought, what if we actually tried to apply Agile workflows to making this movie and finishing post-production? I was like, okay, show me what that is. And he started to put it together, and that was my first introduction to what Agile could do. Then eventually I got a job at EPAM, and many of our projects are responsive web design projects, and it happens that those usually align well with Agile workflows. So I've worked on many projects now that have actually used real Agile. So I've had some exposure to this, and I started to take things that I was learning from these workflows and apply them to my own life. So step one in an Agile project tends to be to create a backlog. And you will find this is by far the most time-consuming part. It took me about 2, maybe 3 days. Because what you're basically doing at that point is you're listing all of the things you want to do ever, right? What do you want to accomplish in life? What do you need to accomplish on a day-to-day basis? Now, the scope is completely up to you, right? You can just say, I'm just going to do Agile for housework. And in fact, there's a great TED Talk about a guy who got his whole family to do an Agile workflow, including his 6-year-old kids, just around chores, and they loved it, right? So you can scale this however you see fit. But for me, I kind of applied it to, Reed kind of indicated I'm a bit of a polymath. Like, I have all these different things, these different projects I have going on. Let me just write them down and figure out what I want to accomplish. And the way you break that down, in this case, I did it by, you see a column here called story and a column called description, right? The story is almost like the topic. Now, this comes from software design where we refer to user stories, right? So if I'm building iTunes, there might be a user story that says, user select song, iTunes displays recommended songs based on that selection, right? That's a thing that has to happen. Now, in order for that to happen, a lot of little things need to happen. A lot of little development things need to happen. Design things, UX things, all these little interactions. Those are the tasks. We put those over in the description. So the story might be Barcamp, right? I was helping plan Barcamp, but the actual specific task might be work on a Barcamp talk, right? That's within the scope of Barcamp. So you're going to take these larger things that you want to accomplish in life, right? Put them into stories, sort of larger things that you want to do. But then for each of those things, break them down into little tasks. This is one of the basic principles of Agile is if you've got a really big task, break it down into smaller tasks. This takes forever, right? Especially if you're crazy like me and you want to accomplish 50 things, right? Once you're done, though, you're going to assign a rank to every single one of those tasks. Now, the rank is very important. And you'll see here 8,000, 7,000, 9,000. Generally, you go from, say, 1,000 to 9,000. And you can decide whether 9,000 is highest or 1,000 is highest. And the reason you do 1,000 is really just because if I have two things that are 8,000 and I have to make a choice, I want to be able to say, OK, this one's 8,001. Totally up to you. And to be honest, I usually rank things way too high anyway. But this is extremely important, as you'll find out once we actually decide what to do. But even more important than the rank is the plan. And there's notes if you want to take notes on particular things. There's category if you want to know the type of thing you're doing. I don't use this that much. But if you're the sort of person who wants to know, I'm doing a lot of writing, but not a lot of outreach work, that's important for you to know. You can write down the type of task that you're doing too. But the plan is the big thing. The plan is, in my opinion, the most important part of this whole thing. It's what makes the engine work. And the plan is basically saying, how difficult is this one task? How much effort is it going to take? Now, you can measure that any way you want. You might say hours, right? I think it's going to take me 1 hour to get this done, so I'm going to give it a 1. Or it might be more abstract and just be, well, I'd call this one a 3, but this one a 1. And as it happens, Agile tends to use what's called the Fibonacci sequence. 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 15, 13, 21. Basically, you're taking the two numbers previously and adding them together. But the reason for this really is because generally speaking, going back to mapping to real life, things aren't generally exactly 1 point harder than another. They tend to be almost more exponentially harder than each other. And as kind of go up the scale, the difficulty kind of jumps more and more. And that kind of just, from experience, maps a little better to real life. But again, you can label this any way you want, but the important thing is to label it, right? It's going to be extremely important to know how much effort you think this thing is going to take. Next, I create something called a dashboard, what I call a dashboard. And as we'll see increasingly, I am taking terms from Agile and in some cases bastardizing them horribly, but trying to apply them to the same basic workflow. So the work of Agile, taking a big thing, breaking it down into smaller tasks, we also take really large chunks of time and break them down into smaller chunks of time, right? So we have what's called a sprint. And a sprint is basically a fixed period of time in which you're going to try to get something done. Usually it's 2 weeks. Some people do 1 week, some people do 3 weeks. It varies with the project, but generally 2 weeks is a good ballpark. So in 2 weeks, we are going to release that feature that shows you your recommended songs. That's what we're going to work on for the next 2 weeks. When you're planning out the sprint, you're basically saying, in these 2 weeks, this is how much stuff I think I can get done. You're making a bet. Now, what you see here is what's called capacity. And capacity is, remember when we gave points to all those little tasks? This is me guessing how many points I think I can get done in 2 weeks, right? And they are guesses, because you can see here this column called burn down, and I'll tell you right now, this is not really the right use of the term burn down, but at the time it made sense to me. But for the sake of argument, let's say this is accurate. Burn down is basically how much I actually got done, right? So I guessed here 9 points, here I got 8 points. It's a pretty good guess. Although I adjusted, the next sprint, I said 8 points. Stuck at 8 points, got ambitious and said, okay, I can do 9.5 points. No, you can't, right? Here I went way wrong, right? 7 points, 4.5, right? And you can see learning. That's the power of Agile. It's not just a to-do list, so you know what to get done. It learns. It's a self-learning system. You are learning about your own capacity as you go. That's a very powerful thing to know that most of us don't know, right? We mostly walk around with a to-do list in our heads, and we have no idea when we're going to do it, how we're going to do it, if we can do it. We just kind of assume that we will because we're told that we have to. This holds us to some version of reality. This holds us to say, you know what? I can only actually get maybe 7 points done this week. And even about that, I could be wrong. Next week I'm going to guess better, and it turned out to be right, right? That's a very powerful thing to know, a very important thing to know, not just psychologically, but also for the purpose of getting things done and being able to signal to others what you can actually get done. By the way, I tend to give my sprints names, just more fun that way. This thread was, I think, Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. I think now I'm on to best Oscar winners from the 90s. But it just, it gives it a little more fun. And as you can see, start date, end date, right? Pretty straightforward, 2 week sprints. Once you've decided how many points you think you can get done, now you go back to that backlog, and every single task in that backlog has a point value assigned to it, right? So now it's just math. I think I can get 9 points done. Okay, let's start counting 9. First step, let's sort things by rank. Let's just sort everything that's at a 9,000, right? That's my highest. If everything that's at a 9,000 adds up to 9, great, right? I know exactly what I want in that sprint. If there's actually 15 things that add up that are 9,000, that add, the points add up to 15, I have to make decisions. And this is the other great thing about Agile. It forces you to make decisions. That's one of the hardest things to do when you're faced with a bundle of tasks, things that you have to do. The hardest thing to do is say, I'm not going to do that, right? I'm going to have to wait at least 2 weeks before I get that done, and I have to be okay with that. And if I'm not okay with it, I have to decide what of these other things is going to jump out. And that just isn't when you make the sprint, right? Let's say I make the sprint, I've made my decisions. About 4 or 5 days in, something comes up. I get an email from my boss saying, this must be done. Okay. I can take that, put it in my backlog, assign it a value, assign it a rank, and then if I want to put it in the sprint that's going on, do it. Go ahead. But what's coming out? Something's got to come out. Your capacity is 9. You can't go over the capacity. What's coming out? It teaches you to respect yourself. It teaches you to respect your own capacity. And to say, you have to make choices. You have to decide what is and isn't going to get done. So for this, a lot of the same columns are still there, the rank, the story, the description, the plan. But we also have added a couple here, done and to do, right? So as I start to knock things out, I can actually take points off and say, well, for that thing that's only a 1 point, I've done maybe 0.5 of it. So now I've only got 0.5 left to do. And I've colored these yellow, the ones that I've actually started. So the ones I haven't started suddenly pop out at me, right? These ones in white. So when I look at my sprint, I can say, I haven't even started that one yet. Maybe I want to work on that one today. So speaking of what you're going to work on today, one of the common things in Agile, especially in Scrum, is this idea of having a stand-up meeting. Remember I was talking about frequent check-ins, maybe every single day? A stand-up meeting is basically a way for all of the different parts of a team to check in with each other. Now, one of the things that's very different about the way I'm applying this versus the way it's usually applied is Agile is usually something you do when you have a whole team, usually an interdisciplinary team, working on something, right? Because it's really hard to have line of sight on what development is working on and what design is working on, what UX is working on, what content is working on, all at the same time on a big project, So we all get together and decide, okay, this is how many points I think this is, and this is what the capacity is for that, right? The way I'm applying this is really just you sitting in a room and making those decisions yourself. However, the stand-up, I think, still kind of applies, right? So the stand-up is basically everybody on that team getting together in a room and having a short meeting. And I cannot stress this enough, a short meeting, right? That's why everyone in this room is standing up, to discourage the meeting going long. And in a typical stand-up, you go around the room and you answer 3 questions. What did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? And do you have any blockers? Simply meaning, is there anything getting in the way of you doing something? That's it. Some other issue comes up, I don't like what's going on in HR. No, we'll take that offline. Or the blocker itself, right? Okay, so I need this from this person. I'm not sure how to get it. Okay, great. We'll talk about that after, right? You keep the meeting short because we've got stuff to do. We want to make sure it gets done. But we also want line of sight so that we know if my blocker is something that you're working on, you can be like, oh yeah, I'll just send that to you in an email. Great, got it, done, move on. So for yourself, every morning, you can look at your sprint and you can say, okay, what did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? And is anything getting in my way? And I find that the way I end up applying this is a lot to do with just saying, I am going to answer the question, what am I going to do today? I'm going to pick one thing from that sprint, and that's going to be the focus of what I try to accomplish that day. Makes it easier for me. And what this helps to alleviate is something called decision fatigue. This is a real thing. Scientists did studies. This one guy, Roy Baumeister, I think, was at the head of this. And what they found out was making decisions actually takes physical energy, just like exercise. It actually makes you weaker. This is why you hear some of those stories about, Obama says he only has a few different options for a suit. He always wears the same kind of suit. Why? Because it's one less decision for him to make throughout the day, right? Agile kind of takes all that decision making about what am I going to do today, what are the things I need to get done, and lets you front load of that into one marathon sprint planning session. You've made a lot of those decisions up front, so you don't have to make them later. Answering this question is probably one of the most stressful things we do every day. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that probably one of the biggest stressors in our lives, I know this is true for me, is the thought that I should be doing something else right now. Right? Agile at least lets you point at something and say, no, actually I shouldn't. This is what I agreed to do. This is what I'm going to do. That other thing, it's going to have to wait for the next sprint. Step 5, and this is a step that I feel, even in real Agile, gets skipped far too often. It's the retrospective. What it basically means is, as we get to the end of the sprint, right, we've released our feature, we're going to sit down and we're going to answer 3 questions, right? What went well? What went wrong? What can we do better next time? And you're going to go over that for everything that you worked on. Usually this is done with stickies, sometimes over beer. I actually encourage you to use stickies. I find I think better when I actually write stuff down. But the idea is to take a look back at all those points, all those things that you said you were going to do, and instead of just writing down, okay, I said I'd do 8 points, I only got 5 points done, and leaving it at that, you say, okay, well, why was that? Where was the actual guess that I made wrong? Why was it wrong? Was it something unexpected? Did I have to go to the hospital unexpectedly, or did something else come up? Was I truthful in the way that I was juggling my work? Or did I kind of fudge on, saying I was only going to try to do these 8 things, but I actually tried to do 15 things? But that retrospective is where the actual learning in the build, measure, learn happens, and it's extremely important. Bonus step. Tile this to your inbox. So this is how I got to inbox 0. Remember, we have stories, right? For all those things you want to do, there's a big story. All right, I mapped those to email folders. So for audience development, there's a folder. For Barcamp, there's a folder, right? Anytime I get a new email, an email that requires action of some kind on my part, I give myself exactly 2 choices. I can do that thing right now, or I can create a task and put it in the backlog. Now, if that task is important enough to be in the sprint, to get done sometime in the next 2 weeks, great. I have to decide what's getting kicked out. But either way, that email is not staying in my inbox to create some kind of de facto to-do list. It's gone. And it's either been acted on, or I know at some point I will act on it. But that's it. So let me tell you about my dirty closet. It's not quite this bad. But when I first tried this out, it wasn't far off from this. And I really wouldn't want you to look at it right now either. So I did my first sprint. I created a big backlog, took like 3 days, created a sprint. Actually didn't take that long. But there came a point where I got to, clean car. Yeah, there's nothing less important than, or nothing not important enough to take out to move that in, right? Everything is more important than that. All right, it's not going in. It's not happening in the next 2 weeks. And a weird thing happened. I would get in my car, my dirty, dirty car, and I would be okay with it. It wouldn't be stressing me out that this car is so dirty. Why haven't I cleaned this car? Well, I know why I haven't cleaned this car, because I just decided I'm not going to do it for 2 weeks. Just look at it and say, that's going to get done in 2 weeks. And I was okay with it. This kind of approach can actually reduce stress because of the stuff that you're not going to do. And knowing that the reason you're not doing it isn't because you're lazy or a bad person. It's because you've got other stuff to do. And you've already thought about whether or not that other stuff is more important. You even gave it a number. Look, it's 9,000. I can't clean the car. It gives you room for yourself. So my boss, who happens to be here, hi. My boss said something really, really smart the other day. I'm not just saying that because she's here. We were planning a presentation. And we really didn't know quite how this presentation was going to be received. We weren't exactly sure how to pitch it, how to angle it. We were making a lot of guesses. And she said something really, really smart. She said, we will try and we will learn. And I thought, well, that's a way healthier attitude than I had about it. I was still back in failure is not an option, right? But again, going back to that agile is not for everything, there are some situations where failure is not an option. But for 90% of the stuff you're ever going to encounter in your life, for 90% of the stuff you're ever going to try to accomplish, this is a much more realistic map of the real world, of how the real world works. So are there any questions?
Can you share a read-only version of your personal agile?
Oh, sure, yeah.
That looks awesome.
Sure, and I can also kind of release a template too, just to go into that. And I should stress, so I use Google Docs just because it gave me the most flexibility, but there are plenty of project management, agile kind of oriented programs out there. I also happen to use Trello, and I do something, by the way, I'm going to confess right now, I do something you should never ever do, and I do it all the time, is I create tasks within tasks. And this is not something you should never do, but I do it all the time just because it works for me. But, so I have a Trello, like I run Content Strategy Philly, I have a Trello for Content Strategy Philly. And what I'll do is, and the Trello is basically just like, to do, doing, done.